Today, I'm going to show you how to solve a photography challenge. We are going to shoot white on white, and I'm going to show you how to do it with 1, 2, or 3 lights. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. If you've ever been asked to photograph white clothing on a white background, I know that it's scary. I absolutely was terrified to do this early on in my career. I was asked to photograph wedding dresses on a white background. But how do you make that look good? For example, with limited gear, how do you get the subject's clothing and background to look white? Or how do you make them not all blend together? How do you show the texture on a dress without it just blending into the background? So that's what I want to show you today. And I'm going to show you how to do it with 1, 2, or 3 lights. And when we do that, we'll talk about the pros and cons of each and how adding additional lights gives you a little bit of control. So basically what we're trying to do is we want to make sure the background still looks white, but we don't have everything just blend together and look kind of mushy. So I'm going to begin with 1 light, and I want to show you a technique that looks a little strange. What we're going to do is we are going to be bouncing the light into the corner of the room. Let's begin by using a single light. Now, one of the challenges of using 1 light is that you don't have as much control. For example, let's say we're lighting the subject with a 3-foot octabox. We can correctly expose our subject, but then the light falls off, it gets darker, and so our white background might actually appear gray. If the goal is to make the background appear white, it might be a little challenging. It's also hard when you're using a single light to avoid shadows on the background. Maybe you center the light and you bring the subject close enough that the background appears white, but the subject's shadow creates a distraction. So one of my favorite workarounds for this is actually creating one huge soft light source by bouncing our main light. So over here on the left-hand side, I have a Profoto D2, and what we're doing is we're bouncing it into the corner of the room. This, of course, only works if you have white ceilings and white walls. So it is bouncing off the walls, the ceiling, everywhere, and it gives us this beautiful, soft, wrapping light. So I want to show you what it looks like and then how I might modify this to improve a white-on-white photograph. You can see that this is giving us a beautiful quality of light on the subject's face and even illumination head to toe. That part is great. And the background is just a little bit off white. It's just a little bit darker. It still looks white, but it's nice because there's a little bit of separation. The subject isn't just blending in with the background. So far so good. However, I want to introduce something called negative fill. Typically, negative fill is something that's going to absorb light or prevent the bounce of light. So here, we're going to use the V-flat World V-flats. This is the V-flats World 2.0. So we're going to bring them into the sides, and what it should do is just maybe add a little bit more definition on the side of the dress and maybe darken the background just a smidge more, which again brings out a little more detail and separation. All right, so let's bring in those V-flats. This is a great illustration of what negative fill does. It's not a huge difference, but if you look at the side of her body, the side of the dress, it just looks like we etched with like a little bit of black, a little bit of shadow, so there's more separation. And the background, it still looks white, but it's just slightly darker, which helps separate her out from the background. So to summarize, if you only have 1 light, bounce the light off the room if you have white walls. Then try adding negative fill to add a little bit more separation, a little more contrast, and a little bit more detail. So with that, we are going to get the shot with just 1 light. Now we're going to move on and introduce 2 lights. Now, one of the other challenges I've found with photographing white on white is it's really hard to get both correct exposure on the subject's face as well as the white clothing. What I found happens is if I keep the detail on the white clothing, the subject's face looks underexposed, it looks a little bit flat. Or if I correctly expose for the face, well then the white clothing goes overexposed. I've run into this so many times, and it is particularly challenging if the subject has a darker skin tone. Think of it this way, a darker skin tone, you want to correctly expose for it, so you overexpose a little bit, and then all of a sudden, the whites of the dress or the background are completely blown out and losing detail. So in this case, the reason that I enjoy using 2 lights at least is because I can begin to layer the light. So for our first light, we're going to get an approximate overall exposure to make sure the dress is correctly exposed. Then our second light is going to be layered on for the face, and we use that to dial it up or down to make sure the face looks correctly exposed. So think of it as two different exposures layered on top of each other. All right, so I'm going to begin with our first exposure, remember, for the dress, and I'm using the same light as before, bounced into the corner of the room. So we're using those same principles, same fundamentals, white walls, light bouncing everywhere to give us soft illumination. When I set the exposure for this first light, I was paying attention to the detail on the dress, making sure that it wasn't overexposed. One of the ways you can check this is to look at your histogram. You want to make sure that there's no information clipping off of the right-hand side, which means that it would be overexposed and losing detail. All right, so now what I'm going to do is introduce our second light. Now when I look at her face, the quality of light on the face is nice, but I think it looks a little underexposed and a little bit flat. So the second light we're going to add is to the left-hand side of the frame. I am using a white beauty dish with a grid. If I want the light to be brighter and have her pop out a little bit more, I can turn the power of the light up. If I want it to be more sculpted, I can move the light further off to the left-hand side of the frame. So it actually gives me quite a bit of control. Now, if my overall main light, the one for the dress, that first light, if it is coming from one side of the frame or the other, I usually try to mimic that directionality of light with the main light. So in other words, if the overall illumination is from this side of the frame, I'll also light the face from that side of the frame, which is what we have going on in this situation. All right, so let's turn on our second light and see what it does to brighten up the face. As you can see, the overall mood of the shot stays the exact same, but now she's correctly exposed on the face. All right, so with that, let's get the shot. Now we're going to move on to 3 lights. Now, one of the things you might have noticed from the first 2 setups is the background was always a little bit off-white. It wasn't pure or crisp or glowing, and that's because we didn't have enough strobes, enough gear to actually evenly light the background. So that's what we're going to do now that we have 3 strobes available. So for this setup, one light is going to be to light the subject head to toe, and then the other 2 are to give us even illumination on a white background. Now, by the way, the background that I'm using here is a Savage Universal Super White background. I'm actually going to start by lighting the background, and then we'll add the main light to the subject. So what we have going on is on either side of the background, we have a strobe with a small umbrella. Now the idea behind this is the light is going to bounce into the umbrella, and then it's going to spread out and light the background. Now, one of my tips for lighting a background pure white is that you don't want the lights to be too close to the background, because what ends up happening is it's not evenly lighting everything. Basically, just get 2 hot spots in little corners of the background. So what you need to do is back them up as far as you can in your space without having light spill on your subject. Another thing that helps you is to bounce light into an umbrella, whether it's a small umbrella or a medium umbrella, because that bounce light spreads out and covers more of the background. So that's exactly what we have going on here. Now, in bigger sets, when people are lighting cyc walls, for example, they'll use more than 2 lights to illuminate the background. Sometimes 4, sometimes 6. They'll do something called a light tree, where they have a single stand with multiple lights on that stand to help light the height of a cyc wall. But here, we're going to be able to do a pretty good job with just 2. So I have both of those lights on to even power. Let's see what it's doing to our white background. This background looks very different than our first 2 setups. It is pure white with no detail. It's really clean and crisp, and it's really hard to get this effect with anything less than 3 lights. Next thing you have to decide when you look at this is how much of that light do you want affecting your subject. As I look at this shot, I can actually see that there's a little bit of light wrapping around the subject, a little bit on the hair, maybe bouncing off the walls a little bit. I think it looks nice, but if you don't want that, that's where you can introduce your negative fill, the same negative fill we saw in the first setup. By adding the black V-flats on either side of the subject, we can prevent the bounce of light, the wrap of light, and it will give us darker edges. So it just depends on what it looks like in your final shot, which one works better for your goals. Okay, so now it's time to add the main light. Your choice of main light will dramatically change the look of the shot. For example, we could bounce the light off the ceiling like we did before if you want a really soft, flat light. I probably want something a little bit poppier, with a little bit more contrast and detail. This becomes important if, for example, you're lighting a dress with fine detail, like beading or embroidery. You don't want the light to be super flat because it gets rid of texture. You actually want to add texture. So what we're doing is on the left-hand side, we're using the white beauty dish, but this time I have gotten rid of the grid. Now that light is going to spread head to toe to light my subject. If you were going for something even more dramatic, you could grab other modifiers, for example, an optical spot or a bare strobe. But those are going to be more creative applications, whereas this is going to be a great commercial application. So let's see what our main light adds to the frame. So you can see in this shot what 3 lights does to give me control over the scene. So when it comes to photographing white on white, think of it this way. You can get a shot with 1 light, you get more control with 2. 3 is what you really need if you want a pure white background, and the more you add, the more you can control the details in the frame. All right, so with this setup, clean, crisp, contrasty, and commercial, let's get the shot. So let's take a look at our 3 shots. The first image with 1 light is soft and wrapping, but we add negative fill to give us a little more detail. Our second shot, we're layering the light. The very first light is to give us the correct exposure on the dress and background, and then our second light is to give proper illumination to the face. And then third, this is where we're able to use 2 lights for the background to make it pure white, and then our final light to illuminate the subject and dress. So as you can see, the more lights you can add to your scene, the more control it gives you. But clearly, 1 light can do the job. A second, a little bit more control. A third, pure white background. A fourth, layering light, you can see that you can build for more control. So if you want to see the gear used to make these images, be sure to check out the links in the description below. And if you want to learn more about studio lighting, building from the ground up, be sure to check out my class, Master Studio Lighting. It is the most in-depth lighting class that I've ever made. In fact, I think it's one of the most in-depth lighting classes out there. All right, everybody, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.